Chapter 16, I want to impose the question, why is the cost of healthcare so out of control? You know, our current healthcare system would not take a lot of work to fix. Just a few hard decisions that would include some bureaucrats losing a very lucrative income for doing very little. You know, during the 2016 presidential campaign, I had a chance to ask Dr. Ben Carson a question. And my question was, every politician has a plan to pay for healthcare. And my question to you is, why does that 1-hour surgery cost $50,000? And instead of a plan to pay for it, I'd like to hear from one politician that has a plan to fix it. Well, a short version of his answer was, there are too many people who have got their fingers in the process that aren't really doing much of anything. Well, okay, but I think we already knew that. But I have a personal friend who works for a surgeon that specializes in hips and knees. And I asked him, matter of fact, I told him I was working on this chapter in my book, and I said, could you get me an itemized bill of something like a knee replacement surgery? Well, they brought me an invoice, and for integrity's sake, the personal information had been omitted. But the total cost of the knee replacement surgery was $31,889 and some odd cents. Now, here's what's interesting. The actual payment to the surgeon, who was by far the most expensive person in the process, was only $2,050. Okay, the anesthesiologist, who was the second most expensive person in the process, was like $650. So the two most expensive pieces of the puzzle were the surgeon and the anesthesiologist, that came to a grand total of $2,700. Now, that sounds very reasonable to me, but where did we get from $2,700 to $31,000 plus? And what happened to the $28,685 in the middle? Well, that's the whole point of the chapter. Let's take a little trip to our government hardware store and let's do some shopping. Okay, now this is the way the guy explained this to me. The tib plate, which is the rod that comes out of the top of the shin bone, just a titanium rod, $4,268. Then you have a thing called a next knee, which is the rod that comes up out of the upper thigh bone, which was $3,290. You have something else here that I can't pronounce. He said it was the plate behind the kneecap, which was $1,700. And then you have what's called a 10 millimeter spacer, which depends on how much bone the surgeon takes off. You know, it could be a 5 mil or a 10 millimeter, whatever, but that was $4,300. Now, then you have a Tupperware type mixing bowl that mixes where you mix the two-part epoxy that bonds everything together, which is $480. I thought, wow, that must have been a heck of a Tupperware mixing bowl, right? $480. Then you have one tube of antibody cement, which was $1,059, and of course several pills that I couldn't pronounce that were, $100 a piece. You have a post-surgery painkiller. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce all these words right, Bivocaine or something like that. Now, according to the internet, the wholesale cost of a tube of this is $14.25. But whether it was the insurance company, the customer, or Medicare, they were charged $612 for a $14 tube of painkiller. Now, what's really interesting is what he explained to me, this Bivocaine is made from the cock on a rooster's head. You know that little red thing on the top? So this is a byproduct of a chicken factory. So there's not a whole lot of money in the raw materials here. Then you had two oscillating blades like the ones you trim out the bottom of a door jamb. One was $140 and the other one was $105. And of course at Ace Hardware, these are $3 to $5 a piece. And I, again, trying to understand why it cost $130 to sterilize a blade. Now, what I just gave you there was only about 10% of the total bill, but I picked these out because I thought they were the most ridiculously overpriced items I could find. Now, going back to the hardware store there on the knee, I know we're talking surgical grade titanium here, not pot metal, I get that. I understand this stuff has to be polished and sterile and super tight tolerances, we all, but the same ball socket, that's built for a car, what they call a ball and joint socket that carries thousands of pounds, and the car moves at very high speeds. You can get the best one on the planet for about $200. And, just in case you're wondering, the hardware on just one knee came to a grand total of $13,599. Now, my friend who gave me this information knows another surgeon who works in the third largest city in India. and you can get the same surgery there done for about 1/3 of the price, okay? Now, how do we get to $31,389 in America? Well, for one thing, there's a lot of answers to that, but I think for one thing, it's a cat and mouse game between the insurance companies, the drug companies, the trial lawyers, and what I call the professional suers we have in this country. Now, I didn't realize this until the name in the legal community for these professional suers is called serial litigants. And it's someone who just really makes a pretty lucrative living going around and suing people that have deep pockets. And somebody has to pay for that. And unfortunately, when it's all said and done, who pays for that is me and you. Now, I remember too, this is one of the things that always catches my eye. Start to notice when you drive around any major metropolitan city, and the biggest, most expensive electronic billboards all say the same thing. Medical malpractice, give us a call. If you Google medical malpractice, there was actually one website that I was just skimming through them one night, and it was a picture of two attorneys standing in front of an airplane, and it said, "Can't come to us? Hey, we'll fly to you." Usually the most expensive ad in any major phone book is the back cover. And it's usually a guy that specializes in suing doctors. Same thing with the yellow pages. When you can make more money suing a doctor than being one, that's when you know the system is broken, okay? And you don't fund something that's broken, you fix it first. I know a doctor that runs a small medical clinic and spends more time with lawyers and patients. And no one can figure out why healthcare is out of control. And see, the reason a hospital has to run tons of unnecessary tests on every person that comes through is because if they miss one little thing, then the hospital gets sued for negligence, and of course that drives up the cost. See, this is such a racket. We buy insurance to pay a doctor so he can buy insurance to work for a hospital so they can buy insurance to protect themselves from a small group of people who love suing people. And I say it's time we stop playing this game and get the crooks and the parasites out of the system that are driving up the cost and just simply say to them, you're going to have to get your health care somewhere else because you are a professional suer. Now, I have health insurance with a very high deductible, and I know that insurance companies have saved some people from complete financial ruin. They have done some good. However, and here's the main point I want you to get out of this chapter. If health insurance and government medical cards did not exist, the only way a hospital would remain solvent is that they would have to readjust the price of everything that they do to where the average man could afford it. And trust me, just like every other business in America, they would make money. But see, here's the point. You eliminate the middleman and the price has to go down because you've got to readjust your price to what the average guy that walks in off the street can afford. And no one wants to do that. They had a segment back a few years ago on ABC. They did a segment on life flight helicopters. And just one example out of many, a family had a 5-year-old daughter that was airlifted to a hospital. The bill was over $47,000 for just a 79-mile trip. And the insurance company covered about 1/3 of the cost, which is about $15,000. And the consent form that Air Methods made the dad sign made no mention of the cost. Well, this Brian Ross asked the vice president, why was this ride so expensive? I mean, almost $50,000 for, a 45-minute trip. And you know what he said? He said, that's a question I can ask. But he insisted he didn't know. Trust me, he knew. And many times you don't even know if you need an airlift until you get to the hospital anyway. Now, let's talk about something else. What about the cost of getting a new procedure or a new drug approved by the government? The hurdles are so ridiculous. That is part of what drives the price up. It's all the hurdles they have to go through to get something on the shelf. I remember when I was in my first year of Bible college, the AIDS epidemic broke, and I remember men pleading on Capitol Hill about loosening the rules for drugs to be approved. And sadly, it can take a new drug, decades to get it on the shelf. And these men were terminally ill, and they were more than willing to sign a medical waiver, a consent form. They said, we're willing to be the guinea pigs for us, for the greater good of humanity. And I have always believed that if a terminally ill patient is willing to donate the last stretch of their life to medical research, let them sign a legal waiver, and maybe in some way their untimely death could be partially redeemed by saving someone else's life. Well, of course, every time you bring this up in a political arena, you got a bunch of arrogant politicians, this isn't Nazi Germany, and on and on and on. But you see, leave it up to a bunch of bureaucrats who have free unlimited health care to tell a dying man what he can and can't do with his own body. At one time, our government even passed a law that prohibited Medicare officials from renegotiating drug prices with drug makers. President Trump tried to challenge that law, but a bunch of politicians who were responsible. See, why would a bunch of politicians who are responsible for our federal budget not want Medicare officials to renegotiate drug prices with drug makers? I'll tell you why. Because if you get all the overcharges and the litigation out of the system, the average guy could pay his own medical bills, and that's exactly what they don't want to have happen. In other words, the middleman would no longer be needed. Do you know how many people make a good living off of overinflated prices in our healthcare system? See, this is not about the cost of healthcare, folks. It's about the cost of politics. Going back to professional sewers, there was one attorney one time on the internet bragging about the huge settlements he had gotten for an honest mistake that a doctor had made. He got one family $47 million for an injury caused by a doctor. Now, as much as my heart breaks for the injured man, $47 million seems like an awful lot of money to me for an honest mistake. Now, let's go to the next level on this discussion. At some point, we're going to have a hard, honest discussion about how much health care a person can get when they are terminally ill unless they pay for it themselves. And that is a tough subject, I know, and we will pick that up in the next chapter.